И в первой сессии первого дня первый наш докладчик Иерей Неманья Мрдженович из Блэктауна, из Нового Южного Уэльса в Австралии, с Православного института всех профилей Мефодия. Тема его доклада «Отношения между Церковью Сербии и Сербской Православной Церковью в Австралии с 50-х до 69-го прошлого века». Это будет на английском языке. Я надеюсь, что все тековины к этому докладу.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you can hear me.
Okay.
Large your screen. Can you make your screen bigger? Yes, that's it. Yes, it.
Thank you. I'm not sure. I have a kind of a bad connection, so I'm not sure if I'm okay to start. But if no one stops me, I'll just continue as if everything is okay. And I also don't know who is sitting in front of me, so I will just like to pass on my regards to all the reverend clergy and all the colleagues here. This sort of presenting over Zoom from the other side of the planet is an experience similar to, you know, having a shower, wearing your socks. So it's not the most pleasant experience you can have, but I'll try to make the best of it. And oh, okay, I can see that there's an archbishop there. Your blessings, your eminence. Apologies for inappropriate jokes. I'm almost positive that I will not be able to present everything that I intended to in the time frame that I have. So I'll just, I want to point out the conclusion first, and then I'll come back and unpack that a little bit. So the conclusion is that the relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia and the Serbian Orthodox Church here in Australia is stronger than ever. It's a very brotherly relationship between the two jurisdictions that basically feel as they're living as one, and that's not that didn't just happen by accident. That was actually, there was a lot of work that was invested in that, but that work is now piled up under a lot of history, and that history is not easy to come to, let's say, especially to our archives. And if there's anything valuable from this presentation, that's the need to take care of our archives. This period, exactly like that I'm talking about, that's 1950 to 1969, it was practically impossible to locate any significant documents in our diocese archives, aside from some local parish archives. And I would like to also pass on my gratitude to our Bishop Siluan and Bishop George as well for their great help, as well to Archmandrite Alexis Rosenthal and to Father Michael Protopopov, and especially to Mr. Nikola Lukic, a Serbian historian from Sydney, who helped a lot with his archives. Why I've chose the time frame of 1950 to 1969 is because, yes, there were some Serbian and some Russian communities in Australia before that, but the significant, let's say, tangible starting point of the development of both jurisdictions was after World War II. And that was no coincidence as well, because the first, the Russian diocese was set up in 1946 in Australia. The first Serbian priest came here in 1948. The first Serbian Orthodox parish was established in Sydney in 1949, and this all has to do with the end of World War II, and a specific timetable for accepting and transporting displaced persons, or so-called DPs, from Europe to Australia. These displaced persons were not just simple refugees. The vast majority of them actually chose to leave their countries because they did not want to go back to live under a communist regime. And in the beginning, it took some 2-3 years under the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, where they were just basically camping in Europe in a few camps in Germany mostly. And then when the International Refugee Organization took over in 1948, they were a much more political, proactive and anti-communist organization. And they just favored all these veterans of anti-communist warfare to go and to repopulate, let's say, the Western countries such as America and Australia, Canada, and so on. And that's how most of our people came into Australia as well. So it was basically from 1950 that we have some sort of tangible church life, both in the Russian and the Serbian Orthodox communities in Australia. Also, when they came to Australia, under this DP regime, they had to spend at least 2 years working somewhere regional in Australia. Why I've chose the 1969 as the end of this period is that, well, basically, in 1969, the Holy Synod of the Serbian Orthodox Church established a diocese covering the territory of Australia and New Zealand, and appointed its first bishop, Bishop Lavrentije Trifunovic. And also in 1969, then socialist Yugoslavia loosened its border policies in the late 60s, especially with West Germany and other countries, and a lot of the labor or workforce from Yugoslavia started trickling into these Western countries, including Australia, and this changed this whole outlook of our basically. Let me just show this. I hope you can see this. This changed the outlook of the demographics of the Serbian Orthodox Church here in Australia. The first Orthodox liturgy in Australia was the Paschal service celebrated on the 27th of March 1820 aboard a Russian ship, Vostok, in Sydney Harbour, and it took about a century to establish a permanent structure and to send a permanent canonical Orthodox priest. There was one Russian Orthodox priest that lived in Australia before that, but turns out not only he was that he was not canonical priest, but it seems that he was not priest at all, but he was an imposter. So the first post-revolutionary Russian immigrants came to Queensland in 1923, and you can see here on this photo, this is the photo of the first Russian Orthodox Church in Australia. This was an Anglican Church of St. Thomas that was basically downtown in Brisbane, and there is now a beautiful cathedral standing in its place, but this was the first Russian Orthodox church in Australia, and it was Father Alexander Shabashev who was the first priest there. Both Serbian and Russian church have a lot to thank to the Anglican Church in Australia, and that's also one of the topics that someone should seriously look into. By the end of 1920s, there were a couple of more Russian Orthodox clergymen in Australia, and the ROCOR Synod from Serbia or Yugoslavia back then recognized this parish in Brisbane as their canonical outpost. There were no other parishes for a significant time. Then there was some others in Sydney organized in the 1920s, and it was Metropolitan Timothy of the Greek Archdiocese who was basically in charge of these local churches. And even during the World War II, when the communications were lost, he even took over these Russian parishes, and he was taking care of them. what happened was at the end of the World War II, when the Ecumenical Patriarchate recognized the Moscow Patriarchate, these Russian churches decided to split ways with the Greek Metropolitan, and that was basically the beginning of the independent Russian community here in Australia. So in 1943, the Greeks recognized the Moscow Patriarchate, and the Russian community did not accept that. There was also in 1946 there was the famous Council of Bishops in Munich, where the council established some new dioceses, including the diocese for Australia, and they appointed Archbishop Theodore Rafalski as its first bishop, or later on archbishop. Also, there was another factor that contributed to the establishment of a bigger Russian community here, and that was, as I mentioned before, the beginning of the Cold War, and between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. So the geopolitical development changed the understanding of the causes of the DPs that I've mentioned before, because originally they were defined as victims of war and fascism, but there was another informal definition that gradually emerged, which was that they were victims of communism as well, as most of them were Eastern Europeans. So the White Russians, former soldiers of the Russian Liberation Army, the Russian Protective Corps, and so on, and especially the clergy of ROCOR, were seen as the most prominent anti-communist fighters, and as such, they were very much welcomed into Australia. I've mentioned the foundation of the Serbian Australian Orthodox community that happened roughly at the same time. There were some small Serbian communities that started forming on the Australian continent since the second part of the 19th century as well, but they didn't even attempt to organize any kind of church life or ecclesial life until after World War II. The true birth of the Serbian Orthodox community in Australia came in 1948 and 1949, when the first priest came, and 1949 when they organized the first church. From the very beginning, the churches wanted to establish a very specific ethnically identified community. So there were some, for example, there were some common buildings that they used. So sometimes the Serbian community would use a Russian church, but they would still have a separate jurisdiction, a separate priest, a separate community, separate governing rules, policies, and everything else. And they would have their own bishop who would encourage them to use the Russian church until the moment they can actually establish and build their own, and then start their own. This was completely different to the situation maybe 10 years ago, when they would have a Russian church with a Greek bishop, with an Antiochian choir master, with Serbian deacon, and so on. This was now unimaginable in post-World War II Australia, where they all wanted to have their own little ethnically based communities. And these ethnically based communities were predominantly, the driving force in all of them was anti-communism, and they believed that soon they will go home and that they will be triumphantly liberating their homelands. The nature of the relationship was such that the first interactions were between the individuals. So it was not an institution and another institution that were building brotherly relationships. It would be actually individuals, such as, for example, Father Theodore Demjanjuk, who was a Russian by ethnicity, but he served all his life in the Serbian church. And for example, he came, so he served in Serbia for 20 years, then he came to Australia, And he was, for a long time, he was the only priest in the Serbian jurisdiction in Melbourne and in all of Victoria as well. And at the same time, in Sydney, there were 4 Serbian priests. And this poor man, he was taking care of the whole Serbian community in Victoria, and yet that same community wrote to these priests in Sydney saying, you should send us a Serbian priest because you have 4 and we have none, even though Father Theodore always identified as one of them. They still didn't accept him as such, unfortunately. But it was such time. Both Serbian and Russian communities were burdened with internal strife and divisions, mostly of political nature. Serbs were mostly divided according to their wartime affiliations with Chetniks, Serbian Volunteer Corps, Serbian State Guard, POWs, and so on. And the Russians were divided into White Russians, Red Russians. Then the White Russians had internal divisions between the members of the European or the Chinese contingent between in the refugee communities and so on. The situation was very confusing for the Australian authorities as well, and they were trying to realize, who is who in this mishmash of sudden differences in the Orthodox jurisdictions. There's abundance of documents in the Australian National Archives where they're trying to work out what in fact is the Orthodox Church, who's in charge, and who can be identified as Orthodox among these new Australians. There was an initiative by a few Russian laymen in Brisbane in the 1940s to establish a separate Russian jurisdiction under the Patriarch from Istanbul, as they said. And in a memorandum that was signed by a Commonwealth migration officer, Mr. Bird, he described the differences between the Russian Orthodox jurisdictions, as you can see here, even calling the ROCOR Synod the Russian Fascist Synod in Munich, which is really mind-blowing. In only a few months, this extremist label will become a big advantage for the applicants to come to Australia with the advent of the Cold War. And this preoccupation with the purity of the anti-communist pedigree inside a community that usually ghettoized the communities from the rest of the society, and unfortunately was left up to certain individuals to establish some sort of contact with the outside world, including the close and friendly churches and communities such as Russian and Serbian. So from the 1950s, the growth was based exclusively on personal relationships. The first Serb to be ordained in Australia was Father Petar Radoš, who came as a theologian in 1951, and he was ordained by Archbishop Theodore in 1952. That was the first ordination of a Serbian Orthodox priest in Australia. He served as a parish priest in Perth later on, and he was a very close friend with a Russian priest there, Father Sergei Putilin, who will later on become the Archbishop of the Russian diocese in Australia. The first Russian who left his mark in the life of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Australia was Father Alexander Jasirski, who came to Adelaide in 1949 from Pančevo, where was a big Russian community, but it seems that he was not the Russian priest there or a priest of ROCOR, but a priest of Serbian Orthodox Church. He was the most influential person in establishing the St. Sava Church in Adelaide in 1950, which was the second Serbian church in all of Australia. And he remained there until 1951 or 2. Then there was Father Theodore Demjanjuk, whom I mentioned before. He served in the Serbian Orthodox Church for all of his life. He was never in any other jurisdiction but that of the Serbian Orthodox Church. When he passed away in 1969, he was buried by Serbian and Russian priests together. And both, to this day, they remember him as the Russian priest. The third and probably central figure of the entire relationship between ROCOR and Serbian Orthodox Church to this day is His Eminence Archbishop Sava Rajevski of Sydney in Australia. Archbishop Sava Rajevski was born in 1892 in Russia, in Tula. but he graduated in the Tula Theological Seminary and the Warsaw Law Faculty. But after the revolution, he came to Serbia, where he graduated from the Theological Faculty of the Serbian Orthodox Church, summa cum laude. His final paper is, I think, to this day, the longest running series of articles published in the theological magazine of the Serbian Orthodox Theology Faculty, Bogoslovlje, or Theology. He married a Serbian woman, Persida Ranđelović from Kraljevo, and he was ordained a deacon in 1941 and a priest in 1942. He served in the Holy Trinity Russian Church in Belgrade. And then after the war, he went to Austria and then as a DP to America, where his wife suddenly died. And after her passing away, he was elected a bishop. He was given a name Sava in honor of the Serbian Saint Sava, and he was ordained the day before Saint Sava is celebrated in the Russian Church, so that he can serve his first liturgy on Saint Sava Day. He was regularly ordaining priests and consecrating churches for Serbian parishes all over Australia throughout his life. And in the big monumental Serbian edition of the book History of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Australia and New Zealand by Father Srboljub Miletić and the protodeacon, his name is escaping me now, sorry, Spasovic. You can rarely find a Serbian church in Australia that's not described as consecrated by a Russian bishop. Archbishop Sava moved to Sydney. He was first the Bishop of Melbourne, vicar bishop to Archbishop Theodore. Then he became in 1955 Archbishop of Australia, and he moved to Sydney, and in his place in Melbourne came Bishop Anthony Medvedev, and who was a great schema monk who started his monastic life in the Milkovo monastery in Serbia under the famous Archimandrite Ambrosi Kurganov. Milkovo was known as the place where the refugees from the Valam monastery continued their spiritual journey. So when Archbishop Sava came to Sydney, the largest to date Serbian ecclesial event happened in 1957. That was the Vidovdan celebration. I'm not going to spend any time explaining what Vidovdan is, but so the Serbs were consecrating their church in Sydney dedicated to St. Lazarus of Kosovo. And at the same time, they wanted to consecrate this first Serbian memorial to the victims of the communist and Ustasha genocides. And this symbolic memorial was in fact a large crucifix with a marble cenotaph at the base, and it was done by Vladimir Pavlovich Zagorodnyuk. Zagorodnyuk was a very famous artist, Russian artist, also from Serbia. If you were in the Serbian Patriarchate building, you saw probably at the main entrance there's a big coat of arms of the Serbian Orthodox Church. That is his work, as well as some monumental works in Sarajevo, Banja Luka, Valjevo, and so on. So one after another, all Serbian churches started asking Zagorodnyuk to make icons for them, iconostases and other church furniture. So these Vidovdan celebrations became a regular thing with the Russian Archbishop, Russian choir singing and so on. And then very often Archbishop Sava would celebrate Vidovdan in one church, then drive for 50 kilometers to another Serbian church. And even Serbian political organizations were relying on the Russian infrastructure as well. Before there were any Serbian centers in Australia, there was the famous Russian House that was founded in 1924. And the Serbian social club Milan Nedić sent a letter to all Serbian churches and organizations in Australia in 1958, explaining that the Serbian social club Milan Nedić managed to find a permanent site for the first Serbian organization here in the Russian House. In 1957, the Serbian churches in New South Wales established the Serbian Orthodox Church Council that became operational in 1959. And the first thing they wanted to do is commemorate the assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia. So they commissioned some large icons for the occasion to be presented to each member parish. And these were, of course, commissioned from Zagorodnyuk. And he made these beautiful icons, but the most important one was for the Russian cathedral in Stratfield. In July and August 1959, with the blessing from His Holiness Patriarch German of Serbia, Archbishop Sava ordained another Serbian priest, Živko Popović, to a rank of deacon, and then in St. Vladimir's Church in Centennial Park, and then later on into the rank of priesthood. When that was happening, they presented this gift from Zagorodnyuk to the Russian Church, this triptych, a famous triptych that was later on taken as on the day when the chapel of the diocesan center of the Russian Church was consecrated. This icon was placed in it, and the Archbishop Sava, again with the blessing of Serbian Patriarch, ordained another Serbian deacon at the time, and they presented this icon to the Serbian and Russian communities as a symbol of our eternal friendship here. After the initial settlement, you can see there was. After this, we come to 1960s towards the point of divergence between the two communities. So after the initial settlement in the new country and the establishment of the closest possible relationship between the Russian Serbian churches in Australia, we can observe a more serious relationship from the 1960s. And at this point, the relationship was not exclusively based on the personal relations between a handful of individuals, but a more functioning structure started emerging. The event of the year, or maybe of the decade, was definitely the visit of His Majesty King Peter II of Yugoslavia that happened late in 1960, from August to early November. When he arrived on 31st of August, he arrived to Perth, went straight to the Russian Church. Then from there he went to Adelaide, where Bishop Anthony Medvedev came to welcome him. Then they went together to Melbourne. Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry, I was getting some mixed messages that there's no there is no sound. I don't know how much of that you heard. I hope that I wasn't speaking just for myself, but the full version of this will also be available to everyone. I can't hear anyone, so I hope that you could hear at least something from what I said.
Yes, Father, we're very sorry. Can you hear?
Yes?
We're very sorry, but the program is kept rushing. The connection here at the seminary is absolutely abysmal, and we have needed to move on to them already. So Sremski Karlovci has just started his, but I hope your paper is available in both languages, and I hope that participants will then be able to answer any questions. And thank you very much for your slides as well, which were.
Thank you.